All right, we'll start with practice question number 1. The very first thing we have to do when we address a question, right, is obviously find what type of question this is. So clearly, if we just read the question right now, which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase, we can know that this is a vocab question, right? Vocab questions now typically include multiple choices in the blank, right, that have generally the same meaning or similar meaning. So most of them are synonyms, and some of them are also words that can be commonly confused, and we just have to really look out for that. We have to really look out for those choices, right? All right, the first rule of any vocab question, remember, we first have to what? We have to, number 1, understand the context. The word itself could have a completely different meaning if the context is different. So context itself will just frame how the word will be used in the text. So we need to read both the first and the last sentences within the blank space, right? Second, define each word in what? The answer choices, right? Now, in this case, we're not just only defining. Not only are we defining it, but we're also saying whether or not they will actually fit into the blank space, right? So in order to do that, there are multiple parts. See, first, A, find their literal / figurative meaning. B, find their grammatical use. A word will obviously have both a figurative and a literal meaning if it comes out in a vocab question. Now, the words with both figurative and literal meanings, right, they will tend to be more likely the answer compared to ones that only have a figurative or only ones that are literal, because ultimately we're trying to find a broad word that could generally substitute the blank space, right? Now, we also need to find whether or not this word actually is grammatically correct if substituted, right? So we would have to see how this word is used grammatically when it comes to just sentences in general. And after we do all this, what's the last step? PIB. PIB. Put it back. To where? We put it back to the chunk, back into the blank space. So now the purpose of this obviously is to see whether or not it actually fits with the sentence as a whole, and it fits all of these criteria, right? So now let's try that, all right? Let's first understand the context. Number 1, understand the context. Modern day graffiti creates the same questions. Most people would agree that a quickly spray painted tag is not art, but some graffiti is very elaborate, well-planned, and objectively beautiful. So what's the first part here? Number 1, most people would say, oh, graffiti, that's not really art, right? Like that's just some random doodles, right? But on the other hand, it could actually be what? A beautiful artwork, right? Objectively beautiful, right? Now we'd have to know what the second sentence is talking about, right? So if we look at it, some graffiti blank the value of an area by making it appear abandoned and unkempt. Now, we were first saying that graffiti could be very beautiful, but what is the second sentence saying now? The value of an area, right, is somewhat influenced by this blank. Somewhat influenced by this blank. And how? By making it appear abandoned and unkempt. Are these positive or negative connotations? Clearly, they're negative, right? Abandoned and unkempt, right? Those are things that people don't really care about, right? They would just rather not see it, right? It's barely treated with care, right? So these are all negative values. So now if you understand the context here, graffiti can either make something very beautiful, it could become a very beautiful artwork, or it could be, on the other hand, something that makes it even worse, like a doodle that we mentioned before, right? And this particular blank space does what? It could also make it abandoned or unkempt. How? Does something to the value of an area, right? So now we understand the context. We're trying to find a role of what this graffiti does, right? And it does something to the value. And now we have these four choices, right? The next thing we have to do, right, is define what? Each word and see whether they have literal and figurative meanings, right? Let's look at A, quiets. Now, when do we use the word quiet? When we quiet a crowd, right? So it's mostly used for the volume of a certain area or a certain place, right? It could also mean decrease the magnitude of something, right? But we would mostly see this word be used in a certain setting, right? A certain particular setting, right? So in this case, the literal meaning exceeds the figurative meaning. Let's see number 2, recedes. What does this mean? Recedes, when something goes back, like an economic recession, right? In an economic recession, we're like literally going back in the economic progress because it is being stalled, right? Now, recedes clearly in this case is not something that could be used with any sort of just, lowering anything, just particularly influencing anything, quieting anything. It's a completely different definition in this case, recedes, right? It's actually going back in this case and going back towards what? The value that wouldn't really make sense in this case, right? So right now, just by looking at the definition, right? Just by looking at the definition, we already know that B might not be the answer, right? So we'll just keep this on the low. C, lowers, just lowering anything. So that has both a literal and a figurative meaning, right? And finally, muffles. Muffles is what? It's similar to quiets, right? It has to do with volume. But now people who know the minute difference between the synonyms, right, between quiets and muffles, right, we know which one is used in a more figurative context compared to a more literal context. That would be quiets, right? Muffles is very specific in its usage, right? You're muffling a person, right? Someone feels muffled, someone feels like they're silenced, right? Whereas quiets is a more general term, right? So in this case, because D is ultimately more specific and what? The literal meaning, oh, sorry. The literal meaning is ultimately much more great than the figurative meaning, right? In this case, muffles would not also be the answer. So right now, B and D, these two answer choices are probably not going to be the correct answer just by looking at the definition, right? But now we also have to find a grammatical use, right? So quiets the value. Does that make sense grammatically? Well, it could be quieting some part of the value. We don't know what it is, right? But technically, grammatically, it would make sense, right? Recedes the value. How do we use recede? Recede would be used as something is actually going back, right? So something is receding, or something is receding from something. Can something recede the value of something? No, that is not grammatically correct. So B would ultimately be wrong. Now we just confirmed it. It's not correct. C, lowers the value. Does that make sense grammatically? Yes, it does, right? Muffles the value. That wouldn't work, right? Because it's too literal, right? So now, officially, we can confirm that B and D are not the answer. Now, for the final step, put it back. We put it back into the what? The chunk, right? So if we put A first and look at the whole sentence, right? Some graffiti quiets the value of an area by making it appear abandoned and unkempt. Now we know that A wouldn't work. Why? Quiets the value makes grammatical sense, right? It could work, right? And it also has some figurative meaning, but the problem is these two words. Quiets the value by making it appear abandoned and unkempt. Is this ultimately lowering the volume of something, the magnitude of something? No, right? It's ultimately lowering the value by making it what? Worsen in quality, right? And quiets does not capture that. How about lowers? Some graffiti lowers the value of an area by making it appear abandoned and unkempt. In this case, right, lowering the value could also mean what? Lowering the quality of that area, right? So in this case, lowers. C would be the answer.